now I'm talking to Mike Clarke, and you were sound artist as Psygnosis, correct?
Yes, I was. From 1992 to 1999.
7 years.
Yes. Yep. Right through the transition period when everything went mad. From home computers to a massive empire. It was a very interesting time.
Was that your first job?
It was the first full-time job, but before I worked there, I did the music for Last Ninja 2. I did some, what was it? I did Little Puff for Codemasters. I did some Disney games, and then I did Bill's Tomato Game freelance for Psygnosis, and then I got a job after I'd done the music, but before the game was released. I got a job at full-time at Psygnosis.
Was that for the Amiga versions? Because Last Ninja 2 was composed by another guy on the Commodore, I guess.
It was the Amiga versions, yeah.
Ah, okay.
Amiga.
So,
except for one Spectrum version. I did one Spectrum game, one Atari ST game, and everything else was Amiga.
was that worth it to do it? I mean, to learn about the hardware and sound drivers and so on, about the Spectrum just for one game?
I didn't actually do any of that. I couldn't program at the time. Only little bits and pieces. Programming came a bit later. So I used a program on the Spectrum called Wham the Music Box, which gave you 2 channels of audio.
Wow, okay.
It's really awful.
So you started after the time when tools were already available?
A little bit. As far as I remember, I had a look at this quite recently, and with that program, the licensing terms were that you weren't actually allowed to use the created music for anything, but I'm pretty sure that loads of games used it against the licensing terms of the original editor. But who would know back in the day? You'd have to be a bit picky about that. Things weren't so legal back then.
I mean, remembering my own childhood in the 90s, you know, people involved into video games weren't very sophisticated when it comes to image or something, you know. I mean, for example, people considered playing a waste of time, and I guess most people, if you told them you did music for video games, they were like, why are you doing that? Why don't you get a proper shop?
Well, it's interesting that all of that wasting time created my entire career. And I think that's the case for so many people back then. Playing games, wasting time. What are you doing playing those games? You're just in the bedroom all the time. What are you doing playing games? What a waste of time. Well, it turns out it wasn't a waste of time after all. Because
especially in UK.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And around here as well. I mean, when I was growing up, I didn't realise how many games were written around here. There were loads of them. Liverpool and the Wirral around Merseyside in the northwest, there was just loads of stuff, loads of companies. So Imagine was here, that became Psygnosis. Mike Singleton was here, wrote lots of big Spectrum games, Lords of Midnight and things like that. Manic Mino, Jet Set Willy, Matthew Smith lived here in Birkenhead, they were all done here. Odin and Thor Software, they did Robin of the Wood and loads of Yes Odd on the Spectrum and the 64. All of those sorts of ones, they all got done here. And there was, well, the company I worked for, Consult Software, that did the conversions for Last Ninja 2 and Star Wars games and all sorts. When I was growing up, I had absolutely no idea whatsoever. And I used to read Zap 64, so it was a big deal to me. The programmers of games were effectively my pop stars, essentially. So it was a bit of a shocker to find out that they were all just up the road. But it was good.
So it started all because of playing games?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. It depends what you mean by it, because I'd started playing games very early on. I can't remember what I got on Commodore 64. It must have been about 1984 or something like that.
Flight 2 was big.
What's that?
Flight 2, for example, was big 1984. Flight Simulator 2 on the Commodore 64.
Oh, right, okay. No, it was before that.
Before that. Okay.
Yeah, I must have been about 7 years old when I got my 64. And I'm born in 1974. So no, I must have been 8, surely. 8 or 9. Anyway, so when I got that, it was all games. That was the whole point. There was nothing else to do on it. I didn't have a clue about programming. I had to look through the manual and how to go, and it was a bit beyond me at the time. I did write a text adventure game, which was absolutely dreadful. It was completely linear. It was over 1,000 lines of basic, and there was no data management or anything. It was so explicit. It was just terrible. And I got to about 1,000 lines of basic, and there were about 4 rooms that you could go into, and I thought, this is ridiculous, because every single room is going to be another 250 lines of code. And that was the extent of it. I didn't really understand programming. I didn't quite get it, because there was a disconnect for me between how the hardware works and what programming was. I remember trying to go through the audio samples on the Commodore 64, and it explained it to say, if you want to play a chord using all 3 channels, you set the parameters for one channel, you set the parameters for the other channel, set the parameters for the other one, and then you play channel 1, play channel 2, play channel 3. And I couldn't comprehend that computers worked that fast, that if you play them one after the other, it does it all at the same time. To me, I'm thinking that's going to go do-do-do, do-do-do. That doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand how this works. But
multitasking.
There was a disconnect between just how fast computers were and what they were actually doing. So I used to come home and it was just games. So I played a lot of games, and I'd always have a lot of friends coming around to play games. And it got so stupid that my mum and dad put a second doorbell on the front door just for me, because they got tired of answering the door for people coming around to play on the Commodore 64.
Okay.
And then I moved on to the Amiga. I sold all of my Commodore 64 stuff and all of my Zap 64 magazines and printer and disk drive and light pen. I had a light pen, that was useless.
It was good for Shadowfire. I actually got one last month.
Really? Did it work for that? Wow, I didn't know that.
Wow. But you have to put the brightness very high.
I remember that, but the contrast really high on the television. So I moved on to the Amiga, because I gave the money to my mum and dad, and then they got me an Amiga for the next Christmas. And it was an Amiga 500, and it would have been around 1987, I think. 87, it was a 500. Okay. And it was the same again. It was the step up, and it was amazing, and I couldn't believe how incredible the thing was. And it was mostly just games. And I had a couple of friends. Well, there was one friend mainly who'd started programming on the Commodore 64, and he was writing a game, and he was doing sprites in the borders and all that. And I'm like, oh my god, this is amazing, but I've got no idea what he's doing. So it's still beyond me at that point. I didn't really have a clue. And when I got the Amiga, I still couldn't program, and it was harder to program because you didn't have the instant interface. I'd run Amiga Basic, and I'd do the 3D vector cube program that was in the manual, and didn't really understand how it works. But I did start to do little bits of assembler around that time, and getting bits out of magazines, and getting bits of software from various places, mostly because I started to go to a computer club near where I lived. And then everybody would be swapping stuff there, mostly copying games. But there'd be utilities and all sorts of things. So I started trying to do little bits of programming. And I got a copy of DevPack and was doing some bits of assembler and just trying my best. I still didn't really get it. I could stick some sprites on and have some bits of graphics on the screen moving around. But doing stuff like blitter operations, I didn't really understand how that worked. And I didn't really understand how to set up audio and stuff. It was really simplistic stuff. And at that same computer club, I ended up getting a copy of the Ultimate Soundtracker. And then that completely changed everything, because I would just come home and then I would just do music. That was it. I didn't know what it was when I first got it. I just, I put it on. Didn't know. I don't really understand to this day how I made it do anything, because it's so rudimentary, the Ultimate Soundtracker. You don't even get a file listing. So when you load a song, you have to know the file name. And then you have to type that in, and then you press enter and it tries to load. And it didn't have, you couldn't just load any samples. It had this thing called a playlist. It was PLST, and it was a list of sample names that linked to a sample file. And that was how all the stuff on STO1 worked. But somehow I managed to load something in, and then I realized this is a music program. I'd never seen anything like that before, but at that point, that was it. I'd come home from school, straight upstairs, and I'd do music. And I did that for quite some time. And it was the same computer.
Playing games.
Sorry?
Better than playing games, right?
It was. And it got to the point where I was playing games and thinking, I can do better music than that. And it started to annoy me a little bit. And I started doing, when I got to a certain stage, probably after I'd written about 50 tracks, I think, when I decided this one's quite good. And then I started doing the further stuff that I did music discs, and I give them out at the computer club. And because of that, somebody there got hold of one of them, and then that's how I got to do Last Ninja 2, because he'd given it to one of his friends who was the director of this company, and he just, I don't know how he got my phone number, but he phoned up my mum's house and spoke to me and said, do you want to do the music on it? I said, obviously. So during one of the half-term holidays from school, I had a week off, so I used that week to go to their offices and did the conversion there with a tape deck with recordings off the Commodore 64 version. And that's how it started. And I did a few other games for them. And I met another friend again at the same computer club, and he got a job as a tester at Psygnosis. And so I ended up, because of him, I got to do Bill's Tomato game, because he was looking out for new games that were coming in. If they needed music, he put me forward, and that worked out well. And then I spoke to the producer of that game and said, have you got any jobs going? After I'd finished college, and that was it. So when I started at Psygnosis, though, I wasn't doing audio. I was a game evaluator, which is like a super tester, if you will. It was, my idea was, I'll just get a job as anything, and I'll always be there, so when a new game comes in, I can step up and go, yes, hello, I'll do the music. I didn't realize at the time, because I was stupid and 19 years old, that because I'm a full-time employee, I wouldn't actually get paid for the music, because I'd just be doing it as part of my job. So I was getting paid very rubbish money as a game evaluator, but it was brilliant. I mean, the first day was amazing. It was amazing. Just turned up, and there I am at Psygnosis. I'm now an employee. And don't forget that my pop stars were game programmers. So here I am surrounded by people who've made all the games that I've been playing for years. And I have my own desk and an Amiga 600, brand new monitor, and a phone. It was amazing. It was amazing. Couldn't believe it. And then the next day, the entire company went go-karting. So what a start. It was really good. And then I got to test loads of new games. I did test current games, but what my job, aside from the test, there was more than just that, you see. Testers would essentially mostly test, but there was me and a couple of other people who were game evaluators. So we would test games. We would evaluate stuff that people had sent in, but we'd also do a lot of other stuff, designed and all sorts of things. And I started doing bits of audio then at the same time. So I did levels for Hired Guns. I did some graphics for Lemmings on the Lynx. I did. It's just bits. If there was something that needed doing and nobody was there, then one of us would just do it. And that was the case with some of the sound as well. So I did sound effects, and the reason that I started programming was because of one of the games, and the programmer said, well, how do we play the sound effects? And I said, give me a minute. And then I went away and learned how to do it, basically, and wrote them a play routine. So that was an intense training course in 68,000 assembler. I remember I used to sit on the train. It took me about 2 weeks, I think. And I would sit on the train with a little exercise book and a pencil, writing, thinking like, right, okay, that for their registers, and all right. And I remember it was probably about the third day. It's very, very clear memory. And I'm thinking, oh God, how am I going to do this? Because I didn't want to just say to them, I don't know, because I was far too proud. And then I remember I was sitting on the train, and it just went, oh. And that was it. It was like the light just switched on, and then I just suddenly understood all the stuff that I didn't quite get before. It was like it just fit into place. That's what the program's doing, and that's how the hardware works. And that's actually not very difficult. So that was the thing then. So I was writing it, because it would take me like half an hour on the train in each morning. So I'd be doing it while I'm in, and then I'd get to work and I'd have a look at it. But I'd have other stuff to do then. So I couldn't really write the thing in the daytime. And yeah, so that was the start, really. And so from then on, I did other bits, and it was mostly sound effect stuff and messing with drivers and so on. And after about 9 months, I got moved over to our secondary building to work on the audio for the video clips for the FMV, for Microcosm on the FM Towns. And I had no idea what I was doing. There was another guy there, Kevin Collier. He was another musician. He did Savage on the Amiga. And he came up and he was there for 3 weeks or a month or something like that. And I remember just going in and I got introduced to Kev, and he sat down and was like, I just had to say, I don't know what I'm doing. What does it mean to put audio onto FMV? How do you do it? But it was so rudimentary, because this is the way it was back then. It was literally just finding sounds, having a look at the video, timing the video as it played, and going, right, at about 3.2 seconds, you have to play this sound. Right, about 3.7 seconds, stop that one. Right, about 4.5, play this sound. And it was very laborious. It was quite hard going. But then I'd give that little bit of piece of paper to one of the programmers on a disc with the sounds that I'd done, and then he'd implement it, and then that's how it would play back. Because we couldn't have linked audio with the video itself, because MP3 hadn't been invented then. So there was no compression that could be small enough to be able to load the video and the audio at the same time. So the video would stream, and then the sounds would play back in real time on top of that. And that was really the first introduction. So after that, I stayed over in that building then, and that's basically where I did most of the games until we got bought by Sony and moved to somewhere nice, because that building was horrendous. It was awful. It was dirty. It was smelly. It was out of the way. We didn't have any internet access. We'd miss loads of stuff because everybody in the main building had email, and everybody presumed that everybody had email, and we didn't. So there'd be even little things like there's a cake in the office, and the email would go around, and we wouldn't know. We'd just be left in the dark over there. And then I was doing so much work at that. It got a bit ridiculous. I know that at one point I was doing 9 games at once, and that was doing some stuff for the Super Nintendo, a couple of Amiga stuff. I'd started to do proper CD audio then as well, because we were doing things had moved on after Microcosm, and we were doing some of the not CD32. We were doing Mega CD games then, so there was other music and task screen stuff to do. There was also bits of PlayStation stuff because we'd started to get the dev kits. But yeah, 9 games. I remember I was in the office for about 3 months every day from 9 a.m. till about 12 at night, and I got totally burnt out by that. It was very, very intense. It was bad for everybody at the time, because after we got bought by Sony, we got lumped in under Sony ImageSoft, because I don't really think they knew what to do with us. So Sony ImageSoft was one of the movie divisions, so we just got put under their control essentially. And we just got these film licenses thrown at us. And because the Mega CD was coming around, and it looked like that was going to be the place to make money, because you have to understand that we were a very high technology company. We'd done a lot of tech demos on the Amiga. A lot of people have seen the PlanetSide demo. That's just an example of a technical thing. It was very much a sort of a future. It was a sort of company. The managing director was very good at spending money on research, because he always wanted to see what was happening 5 years in the future instead of now. So there'll be a lot of these research things and techie stuff. We had a group called the ATG, the Advanced Technology Group, and that was just their job. They didn't really do games. They did bits for games. They did tools and utilities and so on, but they did a lot of, here's a new bit of hardware, let's see what we can do with it. So we'd done a lot of CD stuff, because as soon as CD appeared and we had lots of artists who wanted more data for their animations, that was the way to go. And it meant that we were noticed for the CD stuff that we'd done. And obviously that was an interest in Sony, because they were going to bring out a CD-based console. So we got bought, but we got lumped under Sony ImageSoft and got loads of film tie-ins. So we were doing a lot of Mega CD stuff that was just awful. That is one of the worst pieces of hardware I've ever seen. It's so bad, really dreadful, the capabilities. The design was so stupid. The audio had... The Mega CD itself, you had the FM chip in the Mega Drive, but the Mega CD had 8 channels, and it could play sounds up to 1 megahertz, which is ridiculous. But it only had 64K, So it was completely pointless. There was total disconnect between the bits of capabilities that it had.
And it
But
was
for all
also
the
known for a very limited number of colors.
It was, yeah. It was. How did it work now? It was something like 16 colors, but you could switch the color palettes based on 8x8 blocks. I can't quite remember now, but it was awful. But I used to do all my music for that on the Amiga. So all the Mega CD games were done with Pro Tracker, because I got one of the programmers to convert the Amiga Pro Tracker player to the Mega CD, because it was 68,000, so it wasn't that difficult to do. So what did I do? Dracula and Frankenstein, and I don't know what other stuff I did. There were some other ones. They were all done on Pro Tracker on the Amiga. Same with the Super Nintendo stuff, actually. For Super Nintendo, I used David Whittaker's driver, which we licensed off him before he moved to America, and it was all just in assembler. I can't remember what the chip number is in the SNES now for the audio, but it was just all assembler. So all the music's entered just by entering data into data statements. Proper classic old school way of doing it. So what I used to do, I used to write all the music on Pro Tracker, and then I could essentially copy the lines of Pro Tracker into data statements and set the spacing and stuff properly. It was dead awkward. It's really laborious, because if I'm 2.5 minutes into a track and I miss out one rest step, if I put a delay of 3 instead of a delay of 4, that channel will go out. But I have to listen to 2 minutes 30 of the music to find out that that's the case. So the further you get to the end of the music, the longer it takes to do it, because you have to listen all the way through to find out if what you've put in is correct. So that was awkward. I did Lemmings 2. I did Mega Apocalypse 2, which wasn't released. I was doing Bill's Tomato game for the Super Nintendo. That got killed. I was about to start on another one, but we stopped all external development then. A lot of games got cancelled, all the console ones, all the Mega Drive games and the Super Nintendo ones, because Sony wanted us to start properly concentrating on PlayStation then. So that's what we did.
Actually, back in the... Oh, now we have an echo?
Not for me.
No?
No, mine's okay.
It sounds like it's coming. Okay, now it's gone. Okay,
right.
So let me repeat. So from what I've learned, a lot of music from computer games back in the days were only meant to play for like 2 minutes. For example, a common example would be Last Ninja 3. The intro would fall out of sync after a few minutes, but you would never hear the whole music because the intro would cut off before.
Well, one of the with that sort of music player, as I say, it didn't work like Pro Tracker. Pro Tracker itself actually took up quite a lot of memory. Every pattern is 1K, and I used to have to do. One of the things is because I was very good at using very little memory, so I did all the stupid, very low memory stuff. So most of my games are 3 channels and like 40K and stuff like that. It's really awkward. I very rarely got to use a large amount of sample memory. So I'd be very, very strict about the stuff. I think that, like one of the Bill's Tomato games, I think that one of the tunes there is only 6K. Because I had very tiny chip sounds, getting them to modulate, and I used a very limited number of patterns. But when you're down at those low memory amounts, 1K is a lot for a pattern. So you couldn't have a Pro Tracker style thing on the Commodore 64, for example, in a game, because that's far too much 1K out of the entire 64. So the data style is compressed. So instead of going C2 space 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 D2 space space space, you would say C2 and then wait for 3. Which means you've only really got 3 bytes then instead of using multiple bytes for the thing. So everything can be compressed. But the problem there is that if on one of the channels you got the rest wrong near the end, as I say, the problem's at the end because it's more difficult to check, when it would loop back again, one of those channels would be one rest out. So everything could start to slip every time it loops again. So there was I know there was one of the Rob Hubbard games that did that, where it started to go out of sync towards the end. I don't know what it was now, Rasputin might have been something like that. Yes, but they were awkward days. But in a way,
it's interesting that nowadays as we have, our smartphone player for music, for video game music, people are actually looking into old player code again to fix all the tunes, to make them loop properly and all that stuff.
Absolutely, yeah, which is good. The one thing I want somebody to do, the old school 8-bit players for the Commodore 64 and the Super Nintendo, David Whittaker's on a Super Nintendo. I can't really state for all of them. One of the things that always annoyed me about them was that I don't think Ben Daglish's did it, but certainly Rob Hubbard's did and Dave Whittaker's did. The timings for the music, the tempo, wasn't set to be explicitly aligned to the refresh rate. So on Pro Tracker, for example, you set a speed of 6. And that means move the step every 6 frames, right? And everything's very, very strict. But certainly the way Dave Whittaker's player worked, it would have you'd set a tempo, and then it would count up. And then every time it reached over the tempo limit, that would reset, and then it would move 1 step. Now what that would mean is that there would be an offset, and then it would jump, which means that you could get tempos which were in between 5 frames, 6 frames, 7 frames, 8 frames. But it did it by stuttering. So if you wanted a speed that was the equivalent of 5.5 frames, it would have to stutter basically every other set of 5. And it always annoyed me on Commodore 64 music. And the most severe one is Sanction. Sanction, if you listen to that, it's going da 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 da. You can hear it stuttering all the way through it. And I wish somebody would just rewrite the player to change the tempo and run it off the CIA timer properly so that the stuttering has been removed. I would love somebody to do that. Because that to me is how you could be purist about it and say, well, that's the way it was. It should be left. That's the way it's meant to be. But it's not the way it's meant to be. I'm sure Rob didn't decide that he wanted it to stutter. No, he just wanted a slightly slower tempo. So I think that would be a more pure way to do it. Fix the player so it runs off the CIA timer so that you've got a very proper strict tempo without the stuttering in. That's what I'd like to see.
One thing that annoys me personally the most is that NTSC PAL difference in speed, 60-50 hertz. And I know I once did an interview with Chris Crick, who was sound manager at Epix. And I was asking him why got Summer Games and all these early games and even Zack McCracken and Maniac Mansion, because he did sound effects for those, why was that never fixed? And he told me back in the early 80s that they didn't know.
Well, I had to do different versions of some of my Pro Tracker tunes on the Amiga for the NTSC release because the timings would mess some of the stuff up, especially because some of the weird stuff that I would do with some of the way the tracker patterns worked. So Bill Tomato Game, I basically had to redo every single tune so that it worked with NTSC because it was messed up. So I'd have to slow down the tempo to cater for the increased refresh rate, and then there'd be weird stuff out of sync, and the way the samples, the way I'd do things and try and compress things and get multiple samples into one sound, it would just mess up a bit. So I had to redo it all, and that took like another week and a half just to redo all the tracks for the second time because of NTSC.
And it wouldn't work to fix the player routine?
No, that wasn't a problem. To fix the player would have meant running the refresh. It basically would have meant triggering the Pro Tracker player on an interrupt instead of keeping it on the vertical blank of the screen, which I don't know if all the interrupts were being used. They might have been. But it's a very awkward thing to do. It's much easier just you reset the vertical blank. There we go. There's my reset of the game loop. And you go audio, graphics, controls, and so on. So it was a bit too much work to redo stuff just for that. And again, I don't know if the interrupts are all being used for other things.
I don't know actually personally how it was on the Amiga because I never owned one. But I know on the Commodore 64 there was some really weird stuff going on with NTSC PAL games and composers from UK doing music for American games. For example, as you mentioned, Rob Hubbard, his famous example would be Skate or Die, which plays Skate or Die.
You cut out a bit. Can you repeat?
Skate or Die.
No, you cut out again. Escape something.
It cut out? Okay.
Skate or Die, did you say?
Skate or Die, yes.
Ah, okay, right, yeah, okay, yes.
because that would play wrong on most cracks and would only play correct on the real PAL version. And it's
Right,
interesting
okay,
because it's done by Electronic Arts, but that is an American company, though they
right.
had to do something about the player to play correct.
I'm not sure the specifics of how that'd work, because I know that the way sample playback works on the Commodore 64 is really, really simple. I was shocked when I found out how to do it. It's so simple. You basically just get a 4-bit sample and you play it using the volume register. That's it. It's just a straightforward stream. You stream it with the volume, and because of the hardware error, it just works. It is literal sample playback mechanism. I thought you had to do clever stuff using single-bit pulses and stuff like that, like you would have to play a sample on the Spectrum. But no, it wasn't that. It was really, really simple. But it means that you have to constantly feed the volume register with the data. So you'd have to stick it at multiple interrupts on the screen. I think this is my understanding of it. Not that I've ever done a game on the Commodore 64, but I could imagine that in NTSC all of your raster timings are going to be off. So your sample playback's going to mess up because you're going to be triggering the sample stream at the incorrect times. So I can see that potentially being an issue for how that worked. Because I know Skate or Die definitely had samples in it.
Another thing I've noticed is that a lot of games had the problem that even though the music was fixed in the speed for NTSC apart, the pitch would sound totally different. The instruments would sound different.
The processor had a slightly different timing for NTSC. It was the same on the Amiga as well. The PAL clock is slightly slower. And as a result, I think the actual pitch values for the SID are slightly different as well, just because of clock differences between the two. So yeah, you get slight pitch variances between the two of them.
On the Amiga, I think it was called the Paula chip.
It was, yes. Which is very good and very bad.
Why bad?
It was very good because it played samples. It was very bad because it only played samples. And it felt like a restriction not having a filter. I always wanted to have a proper filter. And what's really annoying is because years later, after when I started doing DSP programming and I realized just how simple it is to do low-pass filters and stuff like that, it would have been easily feasible to write a player that had filters. It would have used a bit more processor time, but not a huge amount. It would have been quite easy to do, and I'm annoyed by that. I'm annoyed that I learned programming too late, because things would have been much better. But that was its problem. It was very good because it could play samples, so it sounded much better than limited synthesis because it was dependent on how good your samples were. But because it didn't have anything else, it was very restricted. Just a filter. It would have been good to have a filter. Yeah, definitely. Or 8 channels. You can do a lot more with 8 channels.
And how was it to make music for the Mega Drive or Super Nintendo? There's not much known about that. I just recently saw a video. For example, the Mega Drive had a sound composing program called Gems that most people used in the 70s or 90s.
Yeah.
For the Mega Drive.
I didn't do any Mega Drive stuff. I tried to do the Mega Drive stuff.
But Mega CD. You said.
Mega CD, yeah.
That was a totally different thing then.
Yeah,
to make music for it.
Yeah. So that was sample playback, whereas the Mega Drive is an FM chip. And the hardware is really complicated. Obviously, you heard the story at Amiga 32 about me doing the Amiga stuff. So after writing my first Amiga sound player, I decided that I would have a go at the Mega Drive one. Surely I can do that. It's a 68,000. It must be easy. It's got more channels. It's a few registers. It's going to be fine. But I got hold of the manual. I went and asked one of the producers and says, "Can you get that for me?" And I just sat there just like, Oh, it was awful. It was so bad looking at that and just thinking, I haven't got a clue what I'm doing. And I was so confident as well. I was so confident because I'd worked out how to program. I was doing proper Amiga stuff and it was getting used in games. And then that was just a totally different world. When it talks about all It's so complicated about make sure this IRQ line is dropped to 0 before you set this register, and set bit 4 in that register before that, and you have to wait for this flag to appear before you can set that control parameter on channel 3. It was just so complicated. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. So I took the manual back and said, oh, it's too complicated.
Okay.
But Mega CD was a totally different chip, and it had sample playback. Now, as far as I can tell, there weren't many games that used it for anything other than sound effects. But because our games were mostly streaming, it was all streaming video. So you couldn't have streamed audio with it. So I did it all in Pro Tracker, and then we did the playback on that. But one thing I was pleased with two things I was pleased with that was that when before Dracula got released, it went to a review for one of the magazines, and I think it was 13%. It was either 9% or 13% they reviewed it as. And so the release got halted. A few of the patterns of some of the baddies got changed, and then I did some music. And so basically after I put the music in, it went up to 73%. So that was quite a big deal. And one of the reviews said that it had this amazing orchestral score that could only be possible by the power of the CD playback in the Mega CD, and it was all Pro Tracker. So I was very pleased with that. That was good. But it was a horrible machine. It really was. Yeah, dreadful.
Well, I mean, another example why the Mega Drive was so horrible, I guess, it actually had two sound chips, a Yamaha and a Texas Instruments, but most games only used one of the two. Yeah,
well, for the Mega CD, most people didn't use it for music. They just streamed music off the CD. But as I say, we couldn't do that because we were streaming video. So all of our stuff was that. Anything that we released using any of the Mega Drive games we released, that was done by Matt Furness. Pretty much everything we released was done by Matt Furness. And that was one of the reasons that I tried to write a driver, because I thought, he's doing all the work here. They're getting loads of money. Let's see if I can do it instead. No, I couldn't. Wasn't good enough. Never mind.
And how was it for the... sorry? Yeah.
Super Nintendo.
Yeah.
I was gonna say about. That was awkward. It's a quirky bit of hardware, and the Super Nintendo chip is basically exactly the same as the PlayStation chip.
Okay.
It was the next one. It's a Sony sound chip in the Super Nintendo, the SPC 700, I think it was. And essentially, the PlayStation has got what was it? It was 8 channels on the SNES. So there's a PlayStation's 24 channels with 2 meg of RAM, and the SNES was 8 channels with 64K of RAM. So it basically was 3 of them wired together with more memory. So it had some quirky things. So it's got hardware ADPCM compression, which gave about 3.5 to 1 compression on the samples. So it meant you could get about 100 and whatever it would be, about 220K equivalent. But if you use the reverb unit, it's got a delay line in it, then you'd need to specify how much memory you wanted to use of that for the delay line. So the longer your delay, the better quality it would be, the more memory you'd have to use, which means you've got less memory for your samples. And because of the hardware compression, it meant that if you had looping samples, they could only loop on 16 sample boundaries, which it made it really quite awkward, because you've got a sample and you spend the time getting the loop right, and then if those don't align on 16 samples, you have to somehow mess with it to make it align with 16 sample boundaries. So it meant I'd have to manually cut out samples to shrink it a little tiny bit, but not mess with it. And sometimes I'd have to repitch it slightly after I'd taken the data out. So it was a bit laborious, and the tools were very laborious as well. This is all stuff that Dave Whittaker wrote and he used, but it was all command line stuff. So command line tools to do the conversion, and then there was a bunch of stuff to create various other data, and then you'd have to include that in the source, and then it was really awkward. Really awkward. A little dev kit there. But that was all right. Quite enjoyed it. It was all good doing audio. I'm glad that I did one. Well, not one, I did a few, but I'm glad that I got to do that. It's better to have the experience of multiple platforms than just doing the one, I think.
Wasn't it tiring for you? Like, oh no, I have to learn another system?
No, not in the sense of that, because I've always been a bit of a sponge for that sort of thing. I like to learn stuff, and I like to learn techie stuff. So it was always interesting to be able to do it. However, the PlayStation, that was frustrating. We got asked by Japan what we wanted for the sound tools for the PlayStation. And what we said was, well, we got the specification. It's going to be 24 channels. There'll be 2 meg of RAM. Right, brilliant. How about you do us a 24 channel Pro Tracker on the PC, and we'll be happy. So that information went away, and then a few months later, I received the very first soundboard for the PlayStation from Japan, and it was for the Mac, and it was a MIDI converter, and it was just awful. So we had to buy Macs, plug in this soundboard to it, and then have to do everything with MIDI files, convert all the samples manually into this format. It's called VAG format on the PlayStation. So you'd have to convert all your samples into VAG format, load it into the bank creation tool. You create a bank of the sounds called a VAB file. Then you would have to load in your MIDI file. You convert that to another format, and then you got the VAB file with the, I think it was a VOB file after it had been converted from the MIDI. And then you could play that back through the sound tools on the Mac. It was so awkward compared to what we asked for. If it'd just been a Pro Tracker, it just would have been so easy. And it was, because it was very big doing tracker stuff over in Europe versus everywhere else. I know that US and Japan did most of the stuff with MIDI, it would appear. Jason Page ended up going, and he ended up working for Sony after he'd done his Commodore 64 stuff, and he wrote a Pro Tracker player. Well, I think it was a fast tracker player for the PlayStation, which became part of the European sound tools, and that went right through for the PlayStation 2, and obviously it was used in hundreds and hundreds of games. That was his big thing. It was a big deal that he did that. It made a big difference. But I wish we'd had it then, but we didn't. That was the first thing that arrived, a Mac with a big soundboard and a load of MIDI tools. It was awful, but we got by. We didn't use that much, to be honest. I didn't do many games like that. It was mostly just for converted sound effects, and everything else was streaming off the CD. I think the biggest one I did was Lemmings Paintball on the PlayStation, and it took ages to convert all the instruments, because I'd done it on the PC first. But it was like the Sony, it was like the Super Nintendo sound chip, but this time your loop positions had to be on 28 sample boundaries, which makes it harder to get your loop points correct, because there's a bigger gap between where it can loop. And so it took me ages. I had to write a little program to do stick in the numbers, and then it would tell me how much to repitch the sample by, so that it would realign the loop points, and then I'd have to repitch the sample during playback. It's really awkward. But it took me, I remember there was a panic for it, and they wanted it. I was like by the end of the week or something, but they'd only told me they wanted me to do it on like the beginning of the week. So I'd set all the MIDI files up, started doing the audio conversions, and I remember I was in there for about 3.5 days with no sleep, just doing the conversions of all the instruments. I was wrecked by the end of that. Yeah, that was really, really intense. We had a few multi-night work periods like that, but that was the worst one, about 3.5 days without sleep. That was dreadful. For Lemmings Paintball, not exactly the biggest, most successful title in the world. I don't even know why I couldn't do it as CD audio. Weird. It's not it's a simple game. I don't know why. Maybe they just, no, I don't know really. But they wanted it as real-time playback instead, so that's what I did.
Funny that you mentioned Lemmings, because Psygnosis is also known for being the last commercial game releaser, and that on the Commodore 64, and that would be Lemmings.
Evidently so, yes. Yeah, I didn't realise that at the time, that was going to be the last one. Although, well, was it the last proper shop release box title? Is that the thing it was?
Yes.
Because Mayhem in Monsterland was after that, wasn't it?
It was a bit earlier, from what
was
I
it?
know.
Was Mayhem in Monsterland?
A few weeks earlier, yes.
Oh, I didn't realise that. Oh, okay. All right, so it was the very last one then, yeah. Yeah. So Lemmings was obviously a big deal. It was a very big deal. I think one thing that impressed me the most with Lemmings was Lemmings 2. The PC version of Lemmings 2 had proper smooth scrolling, and that was amazing for the time. We had this really crappy old PC that we used to burn the ROMs on for testing. And it was so bad and old, somebody put a sticker on it saying insert coin and drew a little slot for it. It was just rubbish. But it still ran Lemmings 2 with smooth scrolling. It was amazing. That was quite a feat, that was. But yeah, Lemmings ended up being, it was such a massive, massive game. It was huge. Now, that was done before I joined. I remember playing it. I worked in a computer shop for a while, and I got invited over to Psygnosis for one of their little presentation things about new games that are coming out. And I think I'd got the Lemmings disc because my mate had started working there at the time, and he gave me one of the Lemmings discs about 2 weeks before that. So that was before it had been released. But he'd been going on about it for weeks and weeks before that, because it was amazing. It was like nothing else before. It was absolutely groundbreaking. So obviously it was a big deal. And so when it came out, it needed to be converted to everything that had a processor and a graphic display. And so that's what happened. So we had it on about 28 formats I didn't even know existed, all the weird machines and stuff in other countries that you'd never heard of. And then it was pretty essential that it be on the Commodore 64 as well, because we were still releasing Commodore 64 games. We'd done Shadow of the Beast, and I think Ballistics was out on the Commodore 64 as well. Not sure what other ones, but yeah, there was, we had released them before, so Lemmings had to go as well. So it did. And for the last few weeks, we had the programmers over, finishing that off, and that was good. It was obviously I was busy, so I didn't really speak to them very much, but it was good to see that coming together. It was a surprisingly good version, because you've got a processor that's less than 1 megahertz. That's pretty slow going, but it handled it well. Yeah, it's really good. Yeah. I can't really think of any Lemmings version that I would think was bad. I think all of them did really well. Even the Game Boy one, you'd think, well, it's black and white, and it's, well, almost black and white, and it's got a screen that's about that big with very low resolution, but it actually worked really well on it. I was surprised by that. So yeah, Commodore 64. It took a while to arrive, being the last game released, but it clearly had to be done, and so it was. Wouldn't have been the complete set without the Commodore 64 version. It had been released on everything else, so yeah, it had to be done.
Yes, I asked you at the Amiga 32 meeting actually why you want to release it on a dead platform, and you said it was just making a cross on a form.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, because the company was like that. We done, I think a lot of the R&D stuff that we done, it didn't get released. Like, if you take the PlanetSide demo that people have seen on the Amiga, that was given away as a demo disc, I think, with the CD-TV. But even though there might have been a plan for a game, it wasn't feasible to make a game at that time. So it was very much a future thing. And that was the same sort of, we know we're not going to make any money out of it, but it's got to be done, because that's cool. And so having Lemmings on the 64 is a similar sort of thing. It's got to be done. It might cost money, and we might not make the money back, but it has to be done. For WipeOut, when we were doing the PC conversion for WipeOut after we'd moved to the nice new building, there was one programmer who worked for, I'm not sure how long it was 4 months or 6 months, who worked doing a WipeOut port for the Silicon Graphics Onyx machine, of which at the time there were only about 8 of them in the country. It was completely and utterly pointless. But it was the most capable hardware that we had. We had to have the Onyx because we'd started doing N64 games, and the original N64 SDK, you had to have an Onyx for it, because all the graphics stuff was done by Silicon Graphics, so you had to have a Silicon Graphics machine as part of the dev kit. So you needed an Onyx, and that's a very expensive proposition. So we had an Onyx, and it was our main server, and it could get used for doing some of the N64 test stuff. And our managing director wanted to have WipeOut running on it, so that's why. So there was money spent on a program on that for 4 to 6 months. It never got finished. I'm not sure the reasons why, but it's a good indication of the type of mentality there was. Just do cool stuff. Clearly, it wouldn't have made any money. It would have just been a little show-off thing to have in a magazine. Look at this! It's an amazing version of WipeOut on this £300,000 computer that you'll never be able to own. But that's the type of company it was. Very
Another thing that is floating around the internet is a MAME ROM of Lemmings for arcades. Like a beta version, but it was never finished.
That right? No, I don't know about that. I don't know how that would have come about. Obviously, we'd been looking at arcade machines because we did. I don't know how many people know about the WipeOut arcade machine. I don't know what year that would have been doing the Lemmings one. But the WipeOut arcade machine was a full, big hydraulic machine, and we had it in the building. I only had a go of it once or twice. I think it just got stuck in the room, and then we had somebody doing the arcade conversion, and it never got finished, so it never got released. But clearly, there was an eye somewhere on doing arcade ports. Obviously, if you can license something and you got successful, then that's where you make your money. I was recently surprised to find that Ocean, I think this is the case, but Ocean had got the Robocop license, but they'd managed to get the license, like the blanket license for games. So the Data East arcade machine of Robocop was actually licensed from Ocean Software. I didn't realise that. I thought it was always the other way around. But of course, if you've got a property, then you license it out and you make money however you can. So I think a lot of I imagine that Lemmings would have been one of the arcade companies coming to us and saying, can we do a version of Lemmings and pay you a license fee for it? We wouldn't have handled that ourselves, even though we did have an eye on arcade stuff at one point. We did do some arcade conversions. We did what did we do? Sega Manx TT Racing. We did the conversion for that for the Sega Saturn. It was an external company doing it, but we had a Manx TT dual player arcade machine that I used to go and play on every lunchtime. That was quite good. Until somebody decided that we were having far too much fun, so they were going to open a charity box, and then it was 10 pence to have a go. So I stopped playing after that.
I see.
Yeah, that was about the time where we had to start paying 10 pence for the cans from the can machine as well. They were free up until then, until the charity box started. But you can't complain about that. It was for charity.
Actually, interesting that you mentioned PlayStation and WipeOut and so on. Actually, what a lot of people don't know, that some arcade machines in the middle of the 90s actually were based on PlayStation hardware.
Yes, that was the case.
For example, Tekken is actually... The Tekken arcade machine is actually a PlayStation 1.
Now, I heard a rumour, and obviously rumours are worth nothing, but I heard a rumour that Sony wasn't allowed to release or advertise the fact that the PlayStation chip was in an arcade machine, that it was something to do with the Yakuza, and they weren't allowed to do it. I don't know how true that was, but that was a rumor that I heard at the time, that nobody knew there was a PlayStation chip because Sony were not allowed to tell anybody that there was a PlayStation chip in it because of some nasty goings on in the business world in Japan. But yeah, it makes sense just to stick the PlayStation in, especially Tekken that was running at 60 frames a second. Why do another version? Just use the same hardware. Yeah, it made sense.
But if you knew it as a player that you could play basically the same game at home for nothing, basically just paying it once.
That was the thing that the PlayStation really did. It changed everything because games suddenly got almost as good as the arcade machine. Ridge Racer was amazing. What an amazing conversion that was. If you play the PlayStation 1, I remember thinking that this is the arcade machine. And it wasn't, because if you then go to the arcade machine, you see that it's better resolution, that the lighting's better, stuff like that. But nevertheless, the play was exactly the same, and it was really fast. We all got a bit obsessed with Ridge Racer when that first turned up. I think we got it quite a while before it was released, because obviously we had all the loads of dev kits and stuff. We had the very early versions of the machines. So as soon as anything new came out of Japan, we'd get it because we were doing all the very early development as well and doing our own tool sets and stuff. So the very first PlayStation that we had was massive. It was gigantic, like a massive big office photocopier with like a big row of 40 fans around it, and that was kept in a locked room with a little control pad on the door that nobody was allowed in. except for the cleaner. The cleaner had access to everywhere. The cleaner and the ATG group, they were allowed in the PlayStation. But I remember that when we got a new version, it'd be, there's a new thing arrived, let's go and have a look. And then somebody would have got the SDK running and booted up the latest demos from Japan. So I think the first one that we had was the dinosaur. People have seen the dinosaur on the PlayStation, but the very first one we had was just the head, because the hardware itself wasn't the full speed yet, so it couldn't do that much. I remember that I think 2 revisions that we got, the speed had doubled in each of those revisions. So at the very beginning it was relatively limited, and it was just the head, and it didn't have the fade out and things like that. But it was unbelievable. We'd never seen anything like that before. It was just proper future stuff. This is the future. This is incredible. I remember there was a Bob's demo on the Amiga where you splitter objects with balls bouncing around, and there was 6,000 of them, and that was just beyond my comprehension. 6,000. I've seen an Amiga demo that does 128, but 6,000. That's just, I can't comprehend it. So we had that, and then we got a new revision. So that big old photocopier got taken away in a truck, and a new one came. And it was all proper breadboards in with wires sticking out of it and everything. And that we got one of the demos, which was the full dinosaur, and it was like, oh my god, how is this possible? It was just mind blowing. It really was. Everybody was standing there going, oh, it was incredible. So we got these demos and bits from Japan, and it was a big deal when some new stuff arrived that we could see. So we got Ridge Racer, and everybody played Ridge Racer. Everybody. Especially one of the designers, Mike Ellis, who was very, very good at Ridge Racer. He was the first person to do all the cars and get the black car at the end and have the reverse tracks. You know, he was way ahead of everybody else. But it was a thing that you'd go over to one of the programmers' machines at lunchtime and say, can you stick Ridge Racer on? And then you can have to go on their dev kit. And it got that way with WipeOut as well. WipeOut got to a point where it started to become really good. And then that was the same case of going to a programmer's desk and there'd be a little queue of people that wanted to have a go at WipeOut. That was when you knew that was going to be a successful game, when people internally wanted to play it.
How about Destruction Derby? That was also a big title.
It was, but that was done by Reflections, so we didn't really have much to do with that.
So you were just a publisher?
Yeah. I didn't even do any music of that. None of us did music of that. They handled that themselves up in Newcastle. I can't remember who did the music, actually. Actually, it might have been PC Music, so maybe it did come through us. I can't remember. I'd have to check the credits. But that was... I didn't see much of that until it was released. There was a demo occasionally, because don't forget that I was off in the other building where WipeOut and Crazy Ivan and after that was what we were doing after the Mega CD stuff stopped. So we were doing those, so we'd have to go back to the other building. It was only down the road, but there was not that much cause to go unless I had to go and see somebody down there or needed to get something out of the warehouse or whatever it was. So occasionally I'd go back and I'd go and have a look in the test room, say hello to people, and I'd see it a couple of times. But it wasn't really until it was actually released. When the PlayStation got released, everybody in the company got a PlayStation. And then we got some of the games. So that was really when I got to play Destruction Derby properly for the first time. And it was amazing feat that they'd done there. They'd really pulled that out. And one of that, I have to say, is down to the very, very good hardware design of the PlayStation and the very good APIs. Because they'd done a really good job of making it easy to program, which they totally forgot about for the PlayStation 2, which is one of the worst pieces of hardware I've ever worked on. It was dreadful. So difficult. But the PlayStation 1 was very good, so it meant that people could get a lot out of it. Ridge Racer, I think it took them 6 months or something, 6 to 8 months to write that from scratch. And that's because the hardware was nice and easy to use. It was really well designed. So that was good. So they did a good job.
But despite it was dreadful, as I said, the PlayStation 2 is one of the longest running game consoles, actually.
I know, yeah. It happens, it's happened with all of them. Whoever's got the most successful console, they become incredibly arrogant. So in the mid-90s, Nintendo were an absolute nightmare. Complete and utter nightmare. Totally in control of everything. You'd have to pay them to get your cartridges manufactured, which were really expensive. You have to be very, very careful about stepping over into one extra ROM size with the bit size of that, because it was so expensive. And as far as I understood it, the licensing terms were such that you could make your game, and the way Nintendo released, you'd always see on Nintendo games licensed by Nintendo. So effectively, no publisher really released their own games. It did happen later on, but certainly in the early period. So it'd get licensed to Nintendo, which meant Nintendo essentially owned everything. And as far as I understand it, you could be in a position where you'd finished your game, you'd paid for the ROMs to be manufactured, you paid for the cartridges, you paid for all the boxes. Nintendo would decide not to release it yet, and you would have to pay Nintendo for the storage of your game before they decided to release it. Because they were in a dominant position, they were doing so well that they could just dictate wherever they wanted. Now Sony took over that. PlayStation was so successful, just wiped the floor with everybody. So when the PlayStation 2 came out, they were the new Nintendo, and they didn't care anymore. They didn't care about it being easy to program. It's like, this is what we're giving you, and if you don't like it, it's tough, because we'll do what we want because we're in charge. And then after the PlayStation 2, the Xbox became very successful, and so Microsoft became the arrogant ones instead. That's how it works. Whoever's on top just becomes a nightmare to work with, and it's been the case all the way through. Remember, I don't know if you remember it, when the PlayStation 3, before it was released, one of the Sony execs said that we want it to be difficult to program because we only want the best programmers using it, and we think that $600 is the right price for it. It was just, what? It was just so ridiculous. I mean, that's what happens. Whoever was in charge, whoever sold the most in the previous generation, would be the most arrogant for the next generation and difficult to work with. So the PlayStation was awful. It was just like a box of chips with no manual. It was so difficult. It was just stupid. There was very little support in the APIs. You would just have a load of registers. Even setting up the graphics chip itself, everything was completely manual. You have to set all the right bits in the right order to set how for example, the perspective correct texture mapping. You have to set that yourself manually, and you can adjust the values to make it do its correction in different ways. It was all just no help whatsoever. There was no just equivalent to start graphics at this resolution. Everything was write that into there, write these 3 bits into that register, and bits 15 to 7 into that register, then call this, then write this register here and that register here, and then if you want to send stuff over to the VU, you have to set this code, put that over into that bit of RAM, put these numbers into this register. It was really, really bad. It was properly just a load of hardware in a box with no help whatsoever. Yeah, dreadful thing.
But you mentioned arrogance of Nintendo, but there were actually companies that worked around that. For example, Atari for the NES released games under Tengen, I think. Yeah. In black shelves.
Yeah.
In black cases.
I don't know. I remember there was a court case to do with that. How did that work? In the UK, there was, I don't know who it was. Was it Daytel or Domark or somebody that wanted to release their own games, and there was a court case against Nintendo to allow them to release their own games without interference, basically. So they had it locked down. It was quite a close thing, and it took legal challenges to be able to break out of that. So yeah, that's the nature of the way it was. And it was like that even from Japan with the first PlayStation. There was very little that we could do. They're very dictatorial. Whatever Japan decided, that's the way it was. Didn't matter what it was. If they'd have given us some rubbish tools and libraries that we could write better in a month or two, it didn't matter. Even though we were also Sony, it didn't matter. And a good case in that was the Psy-Q development kit. Psygnosis ended up essentially taking over SN Systems. It wasn't a buyout, but we started creating our own development kits, the Psy-Q dev kits, and we had it for the Super Nintendo and all sorts of stuff. But the actual proper official Sony Japan dev kit was really, really expensive for the PlayStation. And we'd made our own, and it was about a third of the price. And eventually Sony gave in and then took over Psy-Q as the official Sony development kit for the PlayStation. But it was a very rare case when that happened. It was very much dictated to everybody else. This is what we've made, and you like it, and shut up. Go away and do stuff. Well, can you do this? No, we've decided that's not the way it should be. Okay. It'll make it much more difficult for us. Yeah, it's always been that way. Interesting times. But it was hard to get to that point. That transition period from going from the Amiga to PlayStation and beyond was very, very difficult. There was so much work. Nobody had a clue what they were doing. Really, nobody had a clue. The whole thing was held together with tape and string. Even just from the management point of view, we went from doing small games that were done with 3 people to a game that needed 15. And if you've got a game that needs 15 people, you need to manage those people. But there were no managers because nobody had ever made a game of that size before. So nobody knew what to do. So we'd have producers who were programmers, and programmers weren't the best people, weren't the best for management because they're not really people persons. Programmers generally are quite insular and they like to stare at the screen, don't deal with people very well. So we had producers who had been programmers, and sometimes it would work, but they're not the best. Nobody knew what to do. We ended up hiring people from the video industry to be producers and managers for games, and they had no clue what they were doing because they would come in thinking they knew what to do. But games are totally different than any other medium, and it was very difficult to deal with. We had a lot of problems management-wise and crazy tight deadlines. Like we'd have a dictate that we'd have to finish a game in 3 months on a new piece of hardware. But like one of the film times, I think Frankenstein on the Mega CD, we had 3 months to do it from scratch, and we did it. I don't know how it worked, but we managed to do it in 3 months. It was very, very hard going. And of course, at that time, this is one thing that happened in the dirty old buildings, Century buildings. We had a break-in, and everything got stolen, including my and Tim Wright's music gear, because there was very little support, and because everything was so chaotic at the time, they wouldn't buy us any music equipment. And we'd gone from doing Amiga stuff to doing CD audio, so now we needed to compete with actual released music albums, but we didn't have any equipment to do it, so we had to bring our own stuff in. So I had a Corgo 1 and a Roland SH101. I ended up having to buy a couple of other bits with my very terrible salary. And Tim was the same. He had a Clarke K1, I think. He had to bring in a few other bits and pieces. All of that just all got stolen. The luckiest thing was that both me and Tim used to take home our Amiga 1200s every day.
Wow.
And if that hadn't been the case, we would have lost everything we'd ever done. But we took them home with us, so that was very, very lucky. So they had to pay us then, and they didn't have any insurance for it. So we had to go and say, all of our gear's gone. Well, we'll buy you some more. No, all of our gear has gone. You wouldn't buy us any. So we had to bring our own in, and now it's been stolen. You're going to have to pay us for it. So they had to. They had to pay us money for what it was worth.
Wow.
To us. Yeah, it was ridiculous. As I say, it was very chaotic. It was a crazy time. That place was so dirty. This is ridiculous. I remember I'd totally forgotten about this until a few years after, and one of the artists reminded me of it. But when we left that building, it was a horrible old building, massive high ceilings. It was a terrible place to do audio. We had these really high desks because it had previously been used by architects. So they had these very tall chairs and very high desks. So it was easy to leave things behind them. And when we left and we were moving stuff out, we found that somebody had forgotten about a bin bag that had been left behind one of the desks. And it had been there so long that it had melted through the carpet. And it was so bad. We had to have men come in biohazard suits to clean it up before we left. So we had these two guys, with the backpack with the spray thing. They had to come in and clean the room. It was so bad. That was terrible. Thankfully, we moved out because we were moving to the nice brand new Sony building. So that was good. But that was an awful place to work. It really was. Yeah, it was a strange time. Yes. But when we got to the new place, we had our new studios built for audio. Me and Tim both had custom built stuff. One of the things that they messed up though were two things in our new studios. One was that we walked in one day while they were building it and they'd only put 2 plug sockets in. And so we complained and said, yeah, we need more than that. And so they're like, well, how many do you want? 30. So they had to put in a massive big bank of 30 plug sockets because we were going to get quite a lot of gear at that point. And the other thing was the lights. They put in standard office lights in our studios, which meant that a little bit of bass and they'd start going. So we had to have all the lights taken out as well. Oh, but the third thing was that there was no air conditioning. And all we had was an air system where we had fans out the back of the building and it would route air through the offices. But the building was shaped like this, and the fans were here, and we were there. And we had soundproof rooms. Now, soundproof means basically airtight. And for 3 years, every single year for 3 years, in the middle of summer, it got so hot that the fans would shut down.
Ooh.
And so we're stuck in an airtight room with a load of music gear. We actually had somebody come in and measure it, and they said that the heat produced was the equivalent of having about 9 people in the room.
Wow.
And it was about, how big was it? 15 feet, I think. How many meters is that? I don't know, let's say it was 3 or 4 meters by 3 or 4 meters, the room, with the equivalent of 9 people's heat that's almost airtight and filling up with carbon dioxide. It was very, very uncomfortable, which meant that we had to leave the door open, which defeats the object of having a soundproof room then. And then they ended up getting some air conditioning units for us, where we had to have the big tube coming in through the door. But of course, an air conditioning unit does this. That's no good for doing audio, especially if I'm recording bits and pieces. So it never got fixed. Every single year what would happen is we'd complain, and someone would come up and do some measurements, and they'd go away. And it would take so long that by the time something was going to get done, and this happened for 3 years, they just told us, well, it's the end of summer now, so we'll wait till next year. Next year, same thing happened again. Okay, yep, sort that out. 3 months later, well, it's not worth doing now because summer's over and the fans are okay again. It was terrible. We nearly complained. Well, we tried to complain to the government health and safety, and we found out that there is no upper limit on temperature. So in terms of legal health and safety, an office is not allowed to be too cold, but there's no limit on how hot it can be.
Wow.
Which is the wrong way around, because if you're cold, you can put a coat on. But if it's too hot, there's nothing you can do. So we just had to spend weeks and weeks with the doors open, just working on headphones as much as we can. Close the door when we need to do a proper mix test with the main speakers. Open the door again. It was mad. It was really mad. Yeah. So it was still a little bit stuck together with tape and string when we when we were doing the proper stuff with the nice studios. But it was a big change when we moved over there. It got a lot better. Yeah, it's good.
What did you do after Sony and after the Psygnosis?
Well, Sony got a bit unhappy with us. As Psygnosis, we were still very independent, and we still carried on being a multi-format publisher. So we were still doing. We did N64 WipeOut, we did Sega Saturn on the WipeOut, we did the Sega Saturn arcade conversion of Sega Manx CT. So we were supporting all the other platforms, and Sony eventually said, right, stop, that's enough, no more of that. And so they got quite unhappy about it. I don't know which one it was. It might have been WipeOut 64, which was the last one. That was the one that angered them enough. And we were a proper big empire then. It cost a lot of money. And to be perfectly frank, internally, we weren't doing very good games. We had a lot of games cancelled. Some of them which would have been good, and some of them which didn't end up very well, and so on. So they came in and they just said, right, 300 people, get rid of them. And that's what happened to me in 1999. I was one of that big bank of 300 people, because they wanted to save money and change the way things were working. And so I went freelance then for 18 months doing music. Until I ended up spending all the money. Ironically, I had to go and get a job, and I did a job doing audio programming. I had to move down to London because I didn't get paid money from Sony, because I was doing music for WipeOut Fusion, and it was all a bit of a mess. It was all a bit of a mess, and I ended up not getting paid for it. It was awkward, really, because I'd worked there for that time. I did about 6 weeks work on tracks for them, but they were still treating me as if I was an in-house employee.
Okay, see.
So it was this constant change that, just do that, change that over here. And I'm like, well, this is 6 weeks now. You need to pay me. And they said no. And I was stuffed. I had no money. I had to go and get a job. So I got a job in audio programming because there was no music jobs at the time. Around that period, around 1999, the publishers were sort of downsizing and getting rid of in-house people. Same thing that happened with Psygnosis. So there was very little call for an in-house musician then. And so I had no choice really but to be freelance. And it was difficult because I didn't know what I was doing. I'd never worked for myself before. I ended up turning down work because I was busy doing other work, which if you're freelance, you never do that. You take all of the work no matter how much it is because you don't know when you're going to get the money from next. And of course, I banked everything on WipeOut Fusion for the next set of work that I do. And I was stuffed. So that's when I started doing C++ instead, doing audio programming. So I moved to London. I worked for a company doing architectural visualization. And basically, we made a game engine, but weren't allowed to make games with it. So I did a complete 3D audio game. It was an audio engine for games, basically, for doing 3D audio in real time. And it had a rendering system as well. And then after that, we'd licensed the 3D audio software from a company called Sensora, and I ended up working for Sensora then, doing account management and dev support and stuff with the 3D audio middleware that we had, which was amazing, but it was just ahead of its time. On the PlayStation 2, we could have... Basically, what happened was Sensora had licensed the audio technology for the original Xbox. So the Xbox sound chip was a Sensora chip. And it had 64 channels, 3D audio with reverb and filters and stuff. So our software was a software implementation of all of that. So it basically gave the other platforms, the GameCube and the PlayStation 2, the same capabilities as the Xbox. However, the PlayStation 2 took 5% of the processor. And it's a very, very hard sell saying to a programmer, it's going to take 5%. Because they used to audio take in 0%, and everybody wants graphics. I remember that on the GameCube, eventually they worked out that the audio RAM, because they had 8 meg of audio RAM on the GameCube, didn't really have to be used for audio. So slowly the audio got squeezed out and it got used for text streaming instead and storing other bits of data. So that was generally the way it was at the time. Squeeze, we need more. Because that was another funny transition period whereby out of the PlayStation was the new dawn of this is the way it's going to be. The PlayStation 2 was a step forward to what we could see was going to be next. And it wasn't really until we got to the PlayStation 3 that it got good enough that the games could last and not still look like retro-y games. Because if you go back and look at PlayStation 3 games now, they look very, very good. If you look at Killzone 2 and things like that, they're really impressive. Red Dead Redemption's unbelievable. And it wasn't until that stage that games got good enough technically that they could last, and they got photorealistic enough for them to not look like old retro games. But the PlayStation 2 was still very much the stepping stone to that. So everybody was trying to squeeze as much as they possibly could out of graphics, which was squeezing the audio out as much as it could. So I'd say we were ahead of our time, because when the PlayStation 3 came out, everything was just done in software. So our software would have been perfect then. HRTF binaural stuff with multiple channels and effects and all sorts of things. So what happened was we ended up getting bought by Creative. And so then I was dev support for Creative, where I was still doing the same middleware because they bought everything outright. While I was there, I did get to work on Doom 3. That was a good thing. I did all the reverb environments for that. But that was tough going because we basically had a competing technology to what Creative were already doing. But they were concentrating on the PC space, and we were doing consoles, and they didn't really understand what to do with the consoles. But it worked for a few years, but I ended up leaving there. And then I did some freelance stuff for another year or so, and then I ended up moving back up to Liverpool to start a company with a friend of mine, doing proper programming there. The original reason I came back was to do it was a music product for the PSP that we were pitching to Sega. And what was it called? Pocket DJ it was called. Would have been very good, but we didn't get it signed. But But I ended up staying, and then we ran that company for, I don't know, 5 years or something, and then we had another company after that for another 6 or 7 years, which I've just recently left. So now I'm doing my own thing again.
And still doing music and programming.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. So all the way through our company, I would do it, all of the audio. Because I was technical director, but I couldn't not do audio, because that's my thing. I have to do audio. I consider myself a musician that happens to be able to program, rather than a programmer who does music on the side. So I always had to do music. So all of our games that we did, I'd do music. I did all the freelance stuff as well at the same time. Basically, if somebody asked me to do it, then I'd do it. I wouldn't go and seek it out, because I'd be doing stuff for our company as well. And so I've always done that, yeah. And still doing that now. So just recently I've done a prototype with one of the guys from Psygnosis, who's doing a prototype for something for future. I can't talk about it, but it'll come out if it's signed. But it'll be good. It'll be good. So that's the most recent thing I've done.
So by all this music you're doing and coding, as I said, do you still play games? Do you still consider yourself a gamer? Because you said at the beginning of the interview that is how you started as a gamer.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. The lowest period of playing games was probably during the later PlayStation period at Psygnosis. And that was purely because I was just too busy to play games. And also, I'd prefer to be doing music. So if I'd go home, I'd still be writing music, because I was totally music orientated at the time. So I didn't really have it. I remember doing an interview with, I think it was with Future Music magazine, and they were saying, what games are you playing? I'm like, God, don't play games anymore. I'm too busy. But nevertheless, it all came back eventually, and yes, I do play games. I do play a lot of older games though, because my laptop's not very good. I've got a PC, which is a beefier just for playing games on. But it's a noisy swine. It is quite noisy, and it's awkward because I've got a massive projection screen, so it runs on that. But it means that I'm using the projection screen, so it can't be used for television and films. So I don't get to use it that often for the main PC. So I play more stuff on the laptop, which means that I'm restricted to older stuff. I'm currently playing Sacred 2 again. I already played that on the PS3 and finished that, but now I'm playing as a different character on my laptop. But yeah, mostly older games because of the laptop. I would like to get a new laptop. I will get one, because I'm going to start doing music on it instead. Get rid of my desktop one for music and do everything on the laptop, and then I can play some beefier games again. Otherwise, I have to wait a few years.
What's your opinion about the Switch, by the way, from Nintendo?
It's very good. It's a nice piece of hardware. It's good in that they're not chasing the technology. I don't really think there's much sense in chasing the technology anymore. If a PlayStation 5 comes out, it's just going to be a bit better. I don't think it's going to be doing anything groundbreaking. Graphics will look a bit better. It'll be able to do 4K easier. It will just be faster, just like you've upgraded your graphics card in the PC. So there's not that much mileage anymore in chasing the technology like it was during the PlayStation PS2 to PS3 era. PlayStation 3 especially, that was a massive technological intense research amount on that. Sony spent millions and millions on that, on getting the cell sorted and all of that. But it's not really worth it anymore. It's cheaper just to use commodity chips now, because they've got so fast. The PS4 is a Radeon, basically. It's a Radeon APU, and it makes sense to do it that way, because graphics companies now are focused on graphics, so they can do it better than Sony ever would if they're going to do their own chips anymore. So.
But the problem with the Switch is actually, from what I figured, being at Gamescom and talking to the developers and looking at the internet, that, for example, the Switch has the problem that it isn't capable enough of a stable frame rate. For example, a lot of people complain that Sonic Mania, the latest retro game from Sega, is actually not fluid on a Switch.
People always chase that. I mean, it needs to be fast enough. That's the key thing. I'm sure that however it's programmed, it can always be programmed better, and it would run just fine on the Switch. But your problem is you have to make the business case for all of these things. You can make things incredibly efficient and run very, very fast, but it takes longer to do. It will take more intricate code, which is there's more potential to have bugs, which means it takes longer to fix. So everything comes down to cost. So you want to get things done as quickly and as good as you can in the time and money that you've got available. A lot of gamers miss that. They just think this isn't perfect, therefore it's appalling. I want to kill the developer. They don't understand the fact that you've got to have a deadline. A lot of indie developers, there's complaints that the games aren't good enough, or there's something missing, or why couldn't they have just spent another 3 months? You can't spend another 3 months because you've literally got no money. The magic money for those 3 months doesn't just appear from nowhere to pay 8 people on a full salary. You can't do it, so you have to restrict it. So I am sure on the Switch, if there was enough money and time for whichever developer was doing it, it could be reprogrammed in a way that got the absolute maximum out of the hardware, but there's not much of a business case for it. So there's not a lot you can do about it, really. You just sort of have to accept it. But I think they're doing the right thing by keeping the hardware costs down, by not chasing the technology. They did the same thing with the Wii, and they're massively successful with that. So there's always going to be complaints, whatever you do. There's always complaints on any platform. On the PS4, everybody wants it at 60 frames a second, which is a good thing, because I think that that's the way games should always be. But if you're on a development team, in my experience, most of the time the artists are more interested in impressive screenshots than having a frame rate at 60 frames a second. So there's always a fight there. This is going to look rubbish because the lighting's not good enough. We need more complex models and so on. But if you make it more complex, we're going to drop out of a frame, so we can't do it. Well, that's tough. Well, I think this looks rubbish. Yeah, but I've got to program it. And now we've just about got it in a frame. That's one thing that always happens as well. It's so frustrating. You spend all that time getting it as efficient as you can, and you get everything just running at 60 frames a second. And somehow, that means that all the artists think that, the game's now running at 60 frames a second. That means we can put 7,000 more objects in the game. It's as if it's like, right, the game engine is now working, and it is now infinitely capable because it's now running at 60 frames. So there's always this battle between the two. You've got to lower it. You can't have lighting that set up. You're going to have to reduce the poly count. Can't have that many objects. You'll have to group them into batches. But no, because then it'll look rubbish, and I want to have shadows, and there's always this fight back and forth. And the less capable the hardware, the stronger that fight is between the two. And there's got to be a compromise somewhere. Again, you can't just argue that forever. At some point, you've got to say, right, that's enough. The game's got to get released. So with the Switch, it's good. It's a nice piece of hardware, but it's never going to do what everybody wants. And it's the mentality of the moment. Somebody sees a AAA game on the PC with a 1080 Ti and then looks at the Switch version and thinks, well, the Switch one looks rubbish. But it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter. But there's an expectation that because one thing can do it, that should be able to do it as well, because that's new. It's a new piece of hardware. Therefore, it should be as good as all the other new pieces of hardware. But it's just not the case. They've made it cheap enough. It's a complex piece of thing, being able to switch stuff, and its hardware features are complicated enough. But they had to make it cheap enough, which meant getting cheaper graphics chips and so on. So just going to have to live with it, I'm afraid. Have to live with it.
Another famous example of said the games could be better, but you are running out of money and resources. I guess the most famous one was No Man's Sky.
Yeah.
That totally went disastrous.
Well, expectations were too high. I understand why. I haven't played it still, but as far as I can tell now, the version that is available now is amazing. The current version, after all the patches and the updates, is an amazing game. It's basically what it should have been when it got first released. But I understand. I think that they had a problem managing the expectations of it, and it bit them in the backside a bit. once it got released. But they've done well to update it. I will play it at some point because it does look brilliant and it's exactly my type of game. I love those sorts of things. But you're right. There's an expectation, and there's only so much somebody can do. And that was all self-funded, as far as I'm aware. I thought originally that Sony had funded it, but no, that wasn't the case. Which was clear by the fact that it came out on the PC when the PlayStation 1 came out. Now Sony got very good with that. Old PS2 and PS3 Sony wouldn't have allowed anything like that. But when the PS4 came out, they started really doing it properly with indie games. It was Shahid in the London office was amazing to do that. He took hold of that really well. And he's a proper old school programmer. And he knows what it's like to be an indie. And he really went to town on that. So he ended up getting good deals for developers where Sony might part fund a game, but they wouldn't take the IP rights. The PS4 game that we did, Switch Galaxy Ultra, we had limited exclusivity for Sony. So Sony had paid for the development costs, but it wasn't exclusive to the PlayStation 4. It was exclusive for, I can't remember, 3 months or 6 months. After that, we were allowed to do conversions, and then we did a conversion, released it on Steam. And so they got very, very good with doing that. So No Man's Sky, it wasn't reliant on Sony. So they had to find the money from somewhere else. So I'm sure they got some sort of development funding from them, but yeah, they couldn't go forever because they're a small company and they were trying to do big things. It has to be released. You can't just have infinite money to keep messing with graphics and messing with algorithms. You've got to release it at some point. Because if they hadn't released it at that point, they wouldn't have had the money to do the updates and make it the game it was supposed to be. They've pulled out of it, but yeah, it damaged them a lot. So I don't know what they're going to do next. Hope it's something very good, because clearly they've got a very good team and good technology now. That's how it is.
Interesting that you mentioned time-limited exclusive. For example, Thimbleweed Park was exclusive for the Xbox for 3 months.
Yeah, it's an unusual thing for that. Microsoft are a lot more picky about that sort of thing.
Seriously?
Yeah, in my experience, the way it used to be, I'm not sure how they're operating now, but it used to be the case that Microsoft wouldn't allow you to release a PlayStation 3 version unless they were released at the same time.
Okay.
So you weren't allowed to release your PlayStation 3 version and then release the Xbox One later for the 360. They had to be released at the same time. Otherwise, they wouldn't allow you to release an Xbox One at all. They're quite controlling like that. Yeah. But as I said, the 360 came after the Xbox, so Microsoft became very arrogant around that time because they were the top dog, and whoever's on top has more strict controls and tightens and squeezes development.
I would suggest that gives them leverage. Yeah, definitely. I mean, for example, when I say that Microsoft wouldn't let you do that, I'll bet you that if EA went to them and said, FIFA, and we're going to release it on the PlayStation, and the Xbox One is coming 6 months later, what are you going to do about it? Microsoft's not going to say you can't. There's just no way, because it's absolute guaranteed multi-million seller. So obviously they're more flexible when you've got a bit of leverage like that. So if it's a known developers, where it's a known title that's going to sell, then clearly you get different terms than just their standard one. Obviously they're always flexible, but you have to make the case. And if you can't make the case, they will tell you what to do instead. That's how it works.
But FIFA is, again, a special case. FIFA, alongside WWF wrestling games, are always the last 2 games on a dying platform.
Well, it's funny because dying platforms last a lot longer than people think.
For example, the last game on a PlayStation 2 was FIFA Soccer, and as I said, a wrestling game.
There was a developer here in Liverpool, Magenta Software, and they carried on making PlayStation 1 games for years after it had died. And what they were doing things like the Disney conversions and stuff like that. because kids would still have a PlayStation. They wouldn't have got a PlayStation 2. It might have been a present from their grandmother for Christmas, and that's all they had, and they didn't get the new version. So there were still millions and millions of people, especially kids, who had this PlayStation in their bedroom. So this company and lots of others were just making those games, and they were doing well out of those. So it lasts longer than people think. Even if you think you see the games have disappeared from the shops, the select ones, like the FIFAs, they do last longer because you've still got those guaranteed sales. You couldn't do something weird like take Loco Roco on the PSP, for example. Unbelievably original game, nothing like it, totally weird. I couldn't understand how anybody at Sony managed to sign it off and say, yes, let's do that. It's so weird, the pitch must have been bizarre. But there's no way that could have happened towards the end of a title's life, because nobody wants the weird stuff. The whole audience has been reduced to the absolute basic, most casual game player, which is the FIFA, the WWF, the Disney games, those sorts of things. But you'd be surprised by how much money there is to make out of that and how long it lasts. I remember the Game Boy as well. The Game Boy lasted a long time, a lot longer than you'd think.
But that was because of Pokemon, I read.
No, not just that. Yeah, maybe people kept the Game Boys around for that. But even so, there were companies making a lot of money out of Game Boy games when you would have think it was completely dead. I ended up doing a Game Boy game, music for one, for a game called Force 21. And what I realized at the time, that there were still loads of games coming out and they were selling quite a lot. And I was shocked by the numbers that it was, because I thought that was totally dead and gone. So I spent about a month writing my own music routine for the Game Boy. Unfortunately, I finished it a few weeks before I ran out of money, so it never got used because I had to get a job instead. But that was it. There were so many. I was shocked by how much money there was still to be made at the Game Boy market, that I thought, well, I'll do a music player and then I can do music for all of these remaining Disney games, and conversions you wouldn't believe are selling in those sorts of numbers.
And then there are the niche markets. For example, in Brazil, Tectoy is still doing new Mega Drives.
Oh, really? Oh, right, okay.
And new Master Systems.
Wow.
Based on a Sega license.
Yeah. That's surprising. Yeah, I don't know what the status is with that, but I wouldn't really like to go back to Mega Drive dev kit and all of those hardware registers and weird IRQs and so on. Yeah. Well, yeah, good luck to them. There's obviously sales. A lot of games in Brazil. It's a big market. Yeah, we looked into Brazil one time doing some sort of football games, because the football games sell massively over there in Brazil. It's like cricket games in India. Cricket games in India sell loads. Football games in Brazil sell loads as well. Yeah. So we did look at that one time, but we never. It was on mobile at that point. Very early mobile game, J2ME. And we looked at doing like a head the ball game or something like that. Yeah, big market, Brazil. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me. It's a relatively poor country, so having cheap hardware with old games where you've got.
When I was working for Creative Labs, I had for mobile phones added 3D audio capability. The thing that they got wrong
was that their clone of the OPL3 chip
was more expensive than Yamaha's OPL3 chip.
So nobody wants that. If you're going to do a clone, it's because it's cheaper and you can undercut the original.
So I don't think that ever happened, but they spent a lot of money on that. Millions. So that's what happens. Companies do come up with clones, and they must have found a manufacturer supply for that. Look at SID chips on the Commodore 64. There are fake Chinese copies of the SID.
I know, yes.
Around. There's a market there. They're quite expensive to buy now, just the SID chip.
50, 80 euros?
Something like that, yeah.
For a certain one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got 4 of them in my hard SID Quattro. About 15 years ago, I got my mum to go around the car boot sales and flea markets looking for Commodore 64s so I could take the sound chips out. So my hard
I have a hard SID too, but only the small version, not the Quattro.
Yeah, mine's got 4 in it. I can't use it anymore because the drivers only work on Windows XP, which is a bit of a shame. So I've got it sitting there with 4 SID chips in. I should probably sell the chips. And it's one of every revision as well, revision 2, 3, and 4. So there were 3 6581s and 18580. So it was good because I could use that to play all of the Commodore 64 music with the correct chip according to the composer.
You know, the interesting fact about doing an interview with you is you know so much about the video game industry, about the coding, the music, and so on. Because most pioneers I talk to only know a little bit of everything, but you know like everything about the topic, or a lot about the topic.
It's because I've done everything really. I've been in the industry since 1990, so the very end of the Commodore 64 through the Amiga era into consoles, into the PlayStation, and so on. So I've been through all that. I've had experience with that. Also, because I've been doing programming, I've got familiarity with all the technicalities of all of the aspects of the different bits of hardware as well. And because I've run a game company, I've done management and design, and so yeah, there's just been a bit of everything really. I've had a wide breadth of experience, so I know bits of most parts of the industry.
And you're really interested in knowing the details.
Well, there's a lot of details. There's a lot of story about the games industry. Even just a little bit I've said there about the offices we worked in and the way things happened. Of course, you've got all of the other companies. Somewhere like Argonaut Software. I'm sure there's lots of very interesting stories about what happened there. And when they got bought out by Microsoft, Rare, going from Ultimate Play the Game into Rare Software, there must be hundreds of these really interesting stories. And there's so many people in the game industry. And don't forget, when I say that it was so chaotic at that time, I'm not just talking about Psygnosis. Everything was like that. And when I say nobody had done games of that size before, when we went to the transition to the PlayStation, that was the same across the entire game industry. Nobody knew what to do because it was such a big step up. So everybody
had CDs.
Stories. What's that, sorry?
I mean, suddenly you had CDs. You had like virtual unlimited storage.
So everybody's got these stories about how difficult it was to do that transition. I mean, even looking at Microcosm, most people, certainly in Europe, think of Microcosm, and certainly at the Amiga events, it's the CD32 version of Microcosm, which was a little bit disappointing because it's not the most fantastic game in the world. But Microcosm was basically created a year before that for the FM Towns, and it was only released in Japan. And when we created it, everything had to be made from scratch, everything. So we had to invent our own video encoder and video compression system. All of the audio systems had to be made from scratch. It was really, really complicated stuff, and all had to be done from the very, very beginning. And that's hard going. It really is. And as I say, people only think about the CD stuff from a year later, but we were doing that a year before. And of course, there would have been other companies that were starting to put the feelers out into this new territory, because other companies did conversions to the FM Towns. That was really the first major CD-based machine that could play games. It was basically a PC with a better graphics chip. So we did conversions for Shadow of the Beast and some of the other Psygnosis games to it. And yeah, as I say, there's going to be loads of these stories of people who went through a similar transition period that we did. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff in Japan. I've heard a few things about the hardware getting created for the PlayStation 2, because I know. Well, here's one. Just the Super FX chip. The story of the Super FX chip is really quite interesting, because I know one of the guys who made it, basically, who was in Japan. He was at Argonaut at the time, and they got they did a pitch to Nintendo with this idea of doing 3D stuff, and Nintendo basically had no idea what they were talking about, because everything was 2D. And if I remember rightly, I was told that they were getting design sheets from Nintendo with things like, when you get to this stage in the level, we should have baddies come in from the left or from the right. And they were trying to explain, no, that this is in 3D. We're going to move into the screen. If things don't come in from the left and right. And I know that Dylan, he ended up having to go over and take an Amiga to Japan and show them some 3D stuff like Carrier Command and FA16 FA-18 Interceptor, things that were in 3D to get the point across that we want to do 3D games. So we're going to design a piece of hardware to do it. And he and a couple of the other programs ended up staying in Japan. They've lived there ever since. And they've ended up working on some Nintendo hardware stuff and some of the PlayStation stuff. The original Duck demo in the sync for the PlayStation 2, that was done by him, by Dylan Cuthbert. And they've got some really, really interesting stories as well. It's across the industry, it really is. But you have to look for them. You have to squeeze them out of people. It's funny, a lot of people just don't talk much about it. I know a lot of people don't think it's that interesting.
That's actually true, yes. When finally I found Dave Lowe, who did most music conversions of arcade machines, Street Fighter 2 and a Power Drift, for example. He was very surprised that people want to talk to him.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. A lot of people move. I find artists especially have less of an affinity with the games industry than programmers do. Because artists are in it for the art. For example, at Psygnosis, all of the early artists, they were fine art students. There was no computer courses. They had no interest in computers. They were artists. And they were given a computer and said, do art with a mouse.
Okay.
So for them, it wasn't about the computers and the technology and the games. Obviously, it was about the games, and the games are important.
It was just using a new tool for them.
Exactly. It was just a new way to create art. So for them, it's not really about the games, the game industry itself and things that happened before. It's not really that important to them because it wasn't about the games and the industry for them. It was about the art, getting the art across. And yeah, it's a different mentality. So it is difficult. People don't think it's that interesting and don't really talk about it that much. It's quite difficult to get to squeeze it out of some. Because I know loads of people who will have loads of stories to tell, and they don't.
They wouldn't want to talk to a guy like me.
They might very well. There's a few I could ask, but I don't know. We'll wait and see.
That would be very interesting for me. I mean, Nintendo surprised everybody talking about the Super FX chip that they actually put on a Star.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for taking the time. We will catch up later, I hope.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night.